June 4th, 1942, between 10:22 and 10:25 a.m., 3 Japanese aircraft carriers erupted in flames. In those brief moments, Japan's dominance of the Pacific vanished, and this wasn't luck. This was the payoff of cracked codes, calculated sacrifice, and a gamble that almost failed. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy faced an impossible choice. They could hide their 3 remaining carriers and wait for reinforcements, or they could bet everything on a single engagement. The Japanese were coming to Midway Atoll, and if America lost this fight, the Pacific would belong to Japan for years to come. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had given Admiral Chester Nimitz something more valuable than battleships. They had given him knowledge. The question was whether knowledge could defeat firepower. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. The American Pacific Fleet limped into June 1942 with 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese combined fleet sailed with 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 42 destroyers. America brought 0 battleships to this confrontation, just 7 cruisers and 15 destroyers. In nearly every category that mattered, the United States was outgunned and outnumbered. 6 months of relentless expansion had redrawn the map of the Pacific in Japan's favor. After Pearl Harbor crippled 5 American battleships and destroyed over 180 aircraft on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces had seized territory with stunning speed. Within 24 hours, they invaded Guam and Wake Island. Manila fell by January 2nd. By June, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and much of the Solomon Islands belonged to the emperor. This vast defensive perimeter threatened Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, believed one more decisive victory would force America to negotiate peace. Yamamoto's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Capture Midway Atoll, Horn 300 miles northwest of Hawaii, and the remaining American carriers would have to respond. Then the combined fleet would destroy them in open battle. With no carriers left, America would have no choice but to accept Japanese dominance. The strategic logic was sound. The numerical superiority was overwhelming. Yet the Americans possessed one invisible weapon that could multiply their combat power by a factor of 2 or 3 if they could trust it. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team worked in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, piecing together fragments of intercepted communications. Station Hypo focused on cracking JN-25, the Japanese naval code that protected fleet messages. By late May 1942, Rochefort's cryptanalysts could decode only 10 to 15% of intercepted traffic. From those fragments, they extracted 3 critical pieces of intelligence: timing, forces, and objective. The Japanese would attack in early June. They would commit 4 fleet carriers, and they would strike a target designated AF in their communications. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway. Washington doubted his analysis. To prove his case, Rochefort orchestrated a deception that would validate the entire code-breaking operation. He instructed Midway Island to send a fake radio message in plain language reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down and the garrison was running short on fresh water. Within days, Japanese communications referenced AF's water shortage. The trap had worked. The target was confirmed. Admiral Nimitz trusted Rochefort's analysis over Washington's skepticism. With 10 days of advance warning, Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers northeast of Midway, ready to ambush the approaching fleet. The Japanese had no idea the Americans knew they were coming. This intelligence advantage transformed the strategic situation. Instead of defending blindly, the Americans could choose the time and place of engagement. Instead of reacting to Japanese moves, they could strike first. The knowledge that Rochefort's team had extracted from fragmentary communications effectively multiplied American combat power, turning numerical inferiority into tactical opportunity. Knowing where the enemy would be was only half the equation. Someone would have to pay the price to create the opening for victory. The code breakers had revealed opportunity. Now courage would have to seize it. At 007:10 a.m. on June 4th, Torpedo Squadron 8 began their attack run, flying slow, low, and straight into a wall of Japanese fighters. The TBD Devastator torpedo bombers they flew were obsolete death traps. They could manage only 206 miles per hour at low altitude, barely faster than a modern car on a highway. The Japanese A-6M Zero fighters defending the carriers flew at 331 miles per hour and could tear the lumbering Devastators apart with 20mm cannons. Every pilot in VT-8 knew the odds. They attacked anyway. Between 07:10 and 07:30, Japanese Zeros shredded Torpedo Squadron 8. 14 of 15 aircraft went down in flames. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the water among the wreckage of his squadron. Before he died, one pilot transmitted his final words: "We knew we were going to die, but we had to try." Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed, losing 10 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 6. The American torpedo attacks achieved almost nothing tactically. Not a single torpedo hit its target. The slow, straight attack runs made the Devastators easy prey for Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Yet the sacrifice was not meaningless. The desperate low-level attacks forced Japanese fighters down to sea level to intercept the torpedo bombers. Combat Air Patrol commanders focused every Zero on destroying the slow-moving threats below. The carriers' flight decks, crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled after the morning strike on Midway Island, remained vulnerable from above. The Japanese assumed the torpedo attacks were the main threat. They were wrong. By the time the last Devastator fell into the Pacific, Japanese fighters were at wave-top height, their fuel running low, their ammunition depleted. The sky above was empty. High overhead, American dive bombers were running out of fuel, searching desperately for a target they might never find. At 10:22 a.m., Wade McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attack, the entire engagement converging into a handful of moments. McCluskey, leading the strike from Enterprise, had made a fuel-critical decision 30 minutes earlier. His search pattern had found nothing. His fuel gauges showed he was approaching the point of no return. Turn back now, and his squadrons would make it home. Continue searching, and they might run out of fuel over open ocean. McCluskey chose to keep looking. Then he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast and made a calculated guess. The destroyer was rejoining the main fleet. He followed its wake. At 10:20, McCluskey's dive bombers arrived over Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. From 14,000 feet, the pilots could see the flight decks crowded with aircraft. Fighters were landing to refuel. Bombers sat waiting for orders. The carriers were at their most vulnerable moment, and there were no Japanese fighters above 1,000 feet to stop the attack. McCluskey's Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, screaming down at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Between 10:22 and 10:25 a.m., 3 fleet carriers died. Richard Best, leading a section of dive bombers from Enterprise, put a 1,000-pound bomb through Akagi's flight deck. The bomb penetrated deep into the hangar deck, where armed and fueled aircraft were staged for the next strike. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated bombs and torpedoes. Within minutes, Akagi was engulfed in flames. Best later recalled, "The sight of the carriers burning and sinking was unforgettable." Other dive bombers struck Kaga and Soryu with similar devastating effect. Bombs punched through wooden flight decks and then exploded among aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. Unlike American carriers, which had better damage control systems and more compartmentalization, these vessels became floating infernos. The timing was not luck. McCluskey's decision to continue searching, his choice to follow the destroyer's wake, and his arrival at the precise moment when Japanese fighters were at sea level and carriers were crowded with aircraft, these were the results of planning and critical tactical decisions. The code breaking had positioned the American carriers for ambush. The Torpedo Squadron's attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down. McCluskey's judgment had brought the dive bombers to the target at the decisive moment. In a span of minutes, the course of the Pacific War had shifted. By sunset on June 4th, 4 carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had survived the initial dive bomber attack and launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown. American dive bombers found Hiryu at 11 a.m. and struck her with the same devastating precision that had destroyed her sister ships. By the next morning, all 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, and Hiryu, were gone, along with over 2,500 Japanese personnel. The Americans had lost 307 personnel and 145 aircraft, including nearly all the torpedo bomber crews who had attacked that morning. The strategic consequences were immediate and irreversible. Japan had entered the engagement with a carrier aviation capacity built over years of training and construction. In one day, that capacity was cut nearly in half. The 4 fleet carriers represented not just ships and aircraft, but also irreplaceable, experienced pilots, skilled deck crews, and trained mechanics. Japan's industrial capacity could eventually build new carriers, yet replacing the human expertise lost would take years. The Americans, by contrast, had preserved their 3 carriers and their experienced air crews. More importantly, American industrial production was accelerating. New carriers were already under construction, and pilot training programs were expanding rapidly. The strategic initiative shifted permanently to the United States. Before June 4th, Japan could choose where and when to attack, forcing America to defend everywhere. Afterward, Japan lost the ability to launch large-scale offensive operations. The combined fleet could no longer threaten Hawaii, could no longer cut Allied supply lines to Australia, could no longer expand the defensive perimeter. Instead, Japan was forced into a defensive posture, trying to hold what it had already conquered. Within 2 months, American forces would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the long march across the Pacific that would end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. Midway answers a fundamental question about warfare. Can knowledge and courage overcome raw firepower? In those critical minutes over the Pacific, we see the answer written in smoke and flame. Rochefort's codebreakers gave Nimitz the advantage of knowing where and when the Japanese would strike. The torpedo squadrons paid in blood, drawing fighters down to sea level in attacks that achieved nothing tactically, but everything strategically. The dive bomber pilots executed with precision, arriving at the exact moment when the enemy was most vulnerable. Those crucial minutes from 10:22 to 10:25 a.m. on June 4, 1942, transformed fragmentary intelligence and desperate attacks into strategic victory. The engagement was won before the first shot was fired, in the basement where Rochefort's team cracked codes and in the planning rooms where Nimitz positioned his carriers for ambush. Yet it was also won in the cockpits of obsolete torpedo bombers and in the diving attacks of pilots who turned planning into execution. The confrontation demonstrated that wars are not won by firepower alone, but by the combination of intelligence that reveals opportunity, courage that seizes it, and precision that exploits it. That lesson echoes across military history, from ancient ambushes to modern conflicts. At Midway, America learned it in the hardest way possible, and used that knowledge to turn the tide of the Pacific War.